If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you like us, please follow us on social media at Check Your Head Podcast. And visit us at checkyourheadpodcast.com, where you'll find over 100 mental health resources that will assist you in your mental health recovery. Also, if you want to show your love, you can donate or buy the merch. We have superhero tees and hoodies for sale to remind you and your loved ones that you are superheroes every day. You rock, and we love you.
So listening to Shant talk, it's like I could relate both as an individual with OCD and having gone through very similar experiences, and then as a clinician, hearing him talk about the treatment as well as he did. I was like, both sides of me was like, woo, woo, I love this. And then obviously you were so great and educated. I mean, just the way that you were speaking about it is what we need in this industry to get the word out more about mental health. You didn't come on with very like crass or uneducated questions. I was just so impressed by you. So thank you for all the research you're clearly doing, because it was really, really good, really good. So I'm excited for when it's released and people get to hear it.
Yeah, that's one thing, is that this is the first time, I mean, we're in our second year, but this is the first time I've had someone come on to talk about OCD. And I've been in the healthcare industry for about 15 years. And my great-grandfather actually was a doctor herbalist for the Chinese workers on the railroads. So I think that's part of the interest that I have. And then of course, like with my situation, I feel like I've also come full circle with this podcast, because I feel not only, just the interest in it, but of course, like the compassion. So yeah, I totally get it. But do you have any questions? The other thing is I'm going to create a great introduction for you, because you have so many things that you're doing. So that way we can get right into the questions. But did you have any questions before we started?
No, I was super helpful listening, hearing your podcast. I mean, I just think that, like I said, I have nothing but praise for everything you're doing. And then obviously, like yesterday, after you and I talked and set this up, I was listening to some of the others and watching on the website and stuff. And I just like the idea. I always think that there's certain groups that aren't getting mental health. And I think, athletes, musicians, there's certain groups that I don't think society looks on as the type that gets mental health. So just what you're doing with just musicians and everything that you're doing, I'm just super excited about. But no, I'm looking forward, like I said, to talk about OCD, and I can blend that kind of lived experience with clinical experience and give both sides of the aisle and just really kind of follow where you lead me. And I'm just overall grateful for being a part of this, and thank you for having me today.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, I'm completely grateful for you to be here. And today we have Chris Trondsen, who's not only an OCD specialist, but he's also has OCD and lives with OCD. So you not only have the experience, but also the clinical information that you can share with us. And, I read your story, which first of all is an incredible story. But one thing that really struck me was that like OCD, it took a long time before you got diagnosed. And there's also like misconceptions about OCD. I mean, what do you think is the greatest misconception about this condition?
Yeah, I mean, the reason it took me so long, we noticed that we know based on evidence that the average person who receives treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder, it took them about 14 to 17 years after their first symptom to get help. That's a long time of struggling with this disorder for 14 to 17 years. And like that statistic, when I started showing symptoms as a child, I didn't receive treatment, evidence-based treatment, till my early 20s. So it took me many years, like most people. And I do believe that the misconceptions of OCD out there is the reason why it took me so long. And so some of the main things I hear is that it's a personality quirk. It's something people wish they had because they'd keep their house clean, oh, all people with OCD right now must be loving the pandemic because they get to wipe things down. So I think the misconception is it's all around contamination and germs. Maybe the second category people know is potentially like flipping on light switches or checking things like the stove or leaving the iron on and liking to organize the desk. But the biggest misconception is that people enjoy doing these things. Even if somebody does that have that subtype, people really struggle with that. It's not keeping your hands clean. It's literally taking hours upon hours of showers, cleaning your house, bleaching things, not seeing other people or letting other people into your space. But there's also all these different subtypes of OCD, including taboo, intrusive, harm, sexual, deviant thoughts that people don't want. So there's such a larger world of obsessive compulsive disorder that people just don't know about. And I believe that's a big contributing factor to why it takes people so many years to learn that they not only have it, but to also get the proper diagnosis and then eventually get the proper treatment.
Well, the other thing is that, like with your story, you actually suffered so much that you almost lost your life to it. And so it's not just this quirky condition, but it's something where people really suffer and they can, almost not even leave their house because of all the time that it takes to sort of try and quell these fears. But let's start first with just the symptoms of OCD. What are some of the symptoms? And also, you were talking about the subtypes. Maybe we can get that clear so people can recognize it if they could hear the symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. So the main criteria of having OCD is the O stands for obsession. So that's where people are having intrusive thoughts, intrusive feelings, urges, images, etc. There's something that's coming into their life, mainly through thoughts, but it can be images, it can be feelings, sensations that are absolutely unwanted and intrusive. And because that person has such an unpleasant experience with those worries and those fears, they do some kind of physical or mental act to try to make those thoughts or those feelings go away. So they can be for instance, somebody who has a fear that they may have hit somebody with their car, which is known as hit and run OCD, which falls under the harm OCD category. Somebody may be driving around the block multiple times or checking their car for any damage with the fear that they potentially hurt someone. As with mental acts, people may try to distract themselves or push away thoughts or replace a bad thought with a good thought or a bad image with a good image. So once somebody has those obsessions and responds with a compulsion, it becomes cyclical. And pretty soon over time, the person is having thoughts, they do those compulsions, they get temporary relief, but unfortunately they've reinforced that this issue is a problem and they find themselves not being able to get out of that cycle. And then the D in OCD stands for disorder. So that means that people are spending more than an hour a day on this disorder. Often when somebody's severe, it can be greater than 8 hours a day. In my own story, I was spending 16 hours a day. That's why I didn't leave the house for 3 years of my life, is because you're spending 16 hours a day just consumed with these behaviors, both mental and physical. Now, when it comes to subtypes, that's what makes OCD hard to identify, is because the subtypes that are out there, people aren't hearing about. So obviously we know contamination. So that's going to be the fear of germs, illness, sickness, and so people go into great lengths to keep themselves safe. So that might be lengthy showers, repeated showers, hand washing, cleaning, wiping items down. We also have checking. So that can be where somebody has a fear that maybe they've left a stove on or they've left their car running in the garage and they go to check it to make sure. And then we have symmetry, where people have to keep things organized or in line. But those are sort of the ones people already know about. So now we jump into harm OCD. That's where somebody has the fear or they get images or impulses that they may hurt another person or hurt themselves. Now, when people hear that, people sometimes get scared. Wait, there's people out there that have these harm urges and thoughts. But the difference is somebody with OCD is so disturbed by those thoughts and those feelings that they spend hours and hours a day to try to get rid of those thoughts, rid of those feelings. People will go to great lengths to remove all the knives from their house. They might not drive their car because they don't want to hit somebody. They might not have children because they're afraid that they might accidentally harm their child. Or they're repeatedly checking themselves into a hospital because they fear that they're going to either intentionally or accidentally harm themselves. We have scrupulosity. That's centered around religion. So people have the fear of angering God or going to hell or doing something in sin. We also have sexual intrusive thoughts. So that might be where somebody has intrusive thoughts or images around having sex with a minor or with a family member or with a pet. And once again, people may hear that and think, wow, that person must be disturbed. But once again, these people are great people, good people who have great hearts. But the problem is they're having these opposite kind of fears and actions, which we call ego dystonic. And it makes the person so uncomfortable that they try to push it away. We have hit and run OCD. There's even a type of OCD known as relationship OCD, where the person consistently questions, is this relationship that something they want to be in? And it has somebody who's madly in love with their wife question the relationship even as they're walking down the aisle. So those are just the tip of the icebergs of the different types that we have. We have people, what's called magical thinking, and that's where people feel an urge to perform an act in order to prevent something bad from happening, even if that outcome doesn't match up with what they're doing. So for instance, for me in my own story, I felt like I had to wake up every day at 9:45. If I woke up before or after, I felt something bad would happen to my mom. Now, hearing that doesn't make a lot of sense, but once again, besides just thoughts, the person also has feelings and sensations. So the individual with OCD's body is reacting as if this terrible thing is happening in real time, and that's what inclines them to perform those behaviors to try to reverse it. So we have all these different subtypes, like I just mentioned, that most people don't even know about. We have sexual orientation OCD, where somebody who's heterosexual and happy in a relationship is getting intrusive thoughts that they may potentially be interested in someone of the same sex. And once again, with all these subtypes, it's absolutely the opposite of what that individual wants. And so they're fighting constantly in their own head, their own body, etc. And another category, I'll end with this because there's so many that people know about often, is health OCD. So it's the fear of having a disease or an illness, and they'll take themselves to multiple experts and doctors and even have physical sensations like something's wrong, yet all the tests come back clear and nothing's wrong. It's all mental. So there's all these different painful subtypes that individuals struggle with. And that's why there's so many people going untreated and undiagnosed, because most of the time people don't know that any of these other subtypes exist.
The OCD sounds really individualized as far as the fears and the thoughts that that are going through your head. And I know when I was in a very bad depression and anxiety period that I had thoughts that I would not normally think of. And these thoughts scared me. So all of these things that you're talking about, and there's so many different kinds of fears, and a lot of them logically, are not going to happen, but they feel very real when you're in it.
Absolutely. And when we've looked at fMRIs, scans, when somebody's going through intrusive thoughts, the brain is lit up. I mean, all the centers, especially that frontal cortex where our fear center lies, the amygdala, et cetera, those things are lit up. So even if this person isn't in danger rationally, their brain doesn't know that. Their brain is lighting up. And it's not just the brain, it's the body. People start to notice that they feel those physiological symptoms. Their throat is getting dry, their heart's pounding fast, their blood is being pumped to certain areas, the cortisol levels are going up. So even if that person rationally knows that nothing is wrong, their body and their brain is kind of going off, alarm and basically going off even though nothing's wrong. So the person feels inclined to get back to that kind of neutral safety zone. And as somebody who's lived through it now, after treatment, I can look back and say, why was I afraid of all those things happening? They never did. But in the moment, if you would have talked to me, I literally felt it was life or death multiple hours a day.
Right. And then all of that cortisol and adrenaline that's going through your body for all that time is really bad for your body, right? All of the just the chemicals that shouldn't be there are there, and it totally wears down on your body and your mind.
Correct.
Right?
I mean, this is supposed to be temporary. We're not supposed to be experiencing this. What somebody with OCD goes through, which makes it such a unique disorder, is the person isn't going through like a temporary once a week moment of panic. This individual could be going through stressful situations 10 times an hour. So now you're having somebody, like when I was at my most severe case, 16 hours a day, I was going up and down, fight or flight. Your body isn't meant to have that happen, and it's draining. It burns you out. It makes you exhausted. It makes you worn out. But when we actually do the research, there's a really good, a lot of good research out of Stanford and other locations the thing that starts to happen is it wears on your immune system. You're not supposed to have cortisol and adrenaline, norepinephrine, etc., pumping all day throughout. And so that's why it's people get very weak and very sick when they're going through years and years of stress, and it could be from depression, anxiety, or in this case, obsessive compulsive disorder. So that's part of it as well, as if it goes untreated for a very long time. Like if I see a client who's in their 60s, 70s, 80s, they're having health issues that is strictly from the untreated obsessive compulsive disorder and the just stress and havoc it puts on someone's body.
Well, another thing that a lot of the musicians that come on the podcast, they often say that other people in their family, maybe it's their parents, maybe a a sister or something also has the condition. Do you find that OCD runs in families, or is there like specific causes for OCD?
When we look at OCD is definitely falls more on the genetic ends, the hereditary. So we know that if a family member developed OCD, like a parent, let's say a first-line family member, like a close parent, aunt, uncle, the DSM, which is a Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses, it says that that somebody has about a 10% higher risk of having OCD if a family member got it when they're adult. If a family or loved one who's first generation like that ended up showing signs or symptoms of OCD as a child, now you have 40% higher likelihood of having OCD. So often with my clients, people in their families have shown signs and symptoms of OCD. I know in my own family, like my dad has showed health OCD. My grandfather was a hoarder, which hoarding disorder falls under OCD and related disorders. So we definitely see, depression in my family, anxiety as well. So it's not abnormal at all. There can sometimes be an environmental factor. So we notice that some people, their OCD may have been mild or unnoticed, and then they have a death in the family or a really tragic event. And it's like the floodgates broke down and now everything comes to a head. But all of the research is pretty in agreement that it's not that it caused them to develop the OCD. It's just that the OCD became more prominent once the loss of control and the difficult time happened. But it's definitely something that we know is definitely genetic and passed down generation to generation, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, I think that's important to note, because sometimes when people have mood disorders, they blame themselves, or they feel like, I did this, or, what's wrong with me or something. And oftentimes could be something that is part of our DNA. It doesn't always come out, but like you're saying, things can trigger it, and you have a higher incidence of or possibility of having it happen to you. Now, one thing that Shant talked about was that after he finally got diagnosed and finally found the right therapist, he did something called exposure and response. He called it exposure and response therapy. And I read it stands for ERP. Can you tell me about that? And is that like the main type of therapy that's used for OCD?
Absolutely. So yes, ERP, which is exposure and response prevention therapy, the type of therapy it is absolutely the gold standard therapy for OCD. It's gold standard treatment. And what gold standard means is it's evidence-based, it's been researched, it's scientific, it's been shown through, brain scans and through studies for many years now, since the 70s, to be proven to be the treatment, the gold standard treatment for OCD. So what I always tell people when they're looking for treatment is you have to make sure your therapist not only does ERP, but knows it well. And, like many people, I know Shant talked about this, but like many people, unfortunately, the first therapists we see often don't know ERP, and we go to talk therapy or some other type of treatment, and it doesn't change behavior through talking. And that's what makes ERP different. It's a very behavioral treatment. So what we're asking a client to do, what the E stands for, is exposure. So it's putting yourself in a stressful situation. Response prevention comes in all those physical and mental compulsions we talked about. We're asking to reduce and then eliminate them. So for my own treatment, for instance, I lived with my grandma and my younger sister, and I would get a lot of intrusive thoughts about harming them. And I love them. I mean, they were my favorite people in the world. And I know the reason I would get thoughts about them is because they were very fragile. My little sister was very young. My grandma was very old. And so before treatment, I would just avoid them. I was so worried about hurting them that I'd only be in the room with them if other people were there, or I'd avoid them altogether. And I used to cry myself to sleep because I wanted to spend time with them, but I was so afraid based off the urges I received. So once I got treatment, so like Sean, like it took very many bad, no, I don't want to say bad therapists, but the wrong type of therapy to finally find a specialist in ERP. And so the exposure for me was to spend time alone with my grandmother, spend time alone with my younger sister. Now the feelings would get very loud because I was around them, oh, this is going to be it, you're going to harm them. And we think that we should reassure ourselves or talk back to the OCD or calm ourselves down and say, no, I'd never do that. But the problem is the reassurance just made it louder. The more I try to push it away, the more I resist, the more it persists. So instead, you have to just tolerate and sort of accept and take a passive approach that potentially maybe I will. Let's see. This is like an exposure, or I like to call them experiments. And so why sitting with my grandma, if the thought came up, I let it sit there. When the urge came up, I was like, yeah, let's see, I might do it. Well, of course, what started happening is nothing happened, never harmed them. In fact, I started to be able to spend more time with them. And over time, the thoughts and the feelings subsided, and I was able to hang out with them without any stress. So exposure response prevention is challenging. It has somebody face their fears and live with uncertainty that those fears can happen. But by putting yourself in that and proving it, that's what changes behavior. And ultimately, we want people to live a values-driven life. We want people to spend time with their grandma and their sister. We want people to travel. We want people to go back to church or whatever they're avoiding because of the OCD.
Well, I think it's really important that you bring up that you don't go against and try to quiet your fears. Because I know in other types of CBT, you try to replace the thought with something else. But in this case, you kind of lean into your fear. And I mean, correct me if, I'm thinking that the more you do your fear, the more you actually, your brain and, you're able to see that no harm is being done, and that quells the anxiety. Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, I want to first say that CBT is an amazing type of treatment. It's absolutely wonderful. I've been trained in it, and it's incredible for other disorders. That's what makes OCD so unique. Is ERP is actually a type of CBT. I think of CBT as like California and ERP is like LA. Like it's a type of CBT. It has the same principles about changing your relationship with your thoughts and your behaviors, or changing your behaviors. The difference is just what you said. I mean, if somebody's dealing with traditional generalized anxiety disorder, they're going to replace or challenge some of those absolutely distorted thoughts. But in OCD, those thoughts are coming at you a mile a minute, multiple times. So if you were to sit there and try to replace a bad thought, you're going to get a new bad thought 5 minutes later. And pretty soon you're spending 16 hours a day chasing these thoughts around. So we actually lean into it. And just like you said, it's called inhibitory learning. We actually learn that no danger occurs. And we teach ourselves that our brain unfortunately puts something in the dangerous category that we can move over to the safe category. And that's why somebody who used to be afraid of driving or going to church or being around children or whatever their fear is around, as soon as they learn that nothing bad will happen, they relax, they get more comfortable, and pretty soon they can go back to the activity that was taken away. But yes, the learning happens. And that's why people, if they do treatment right, don't have a relapse 5 days later, is because learning occurred. Your brain has neuroplasticity and the ability to change because of learning. And in my own case, all the things that I had feared, I conquered. I overcame. I went back to being around people, my family. I went back to all my life how it was prior to the treatment. And I had learned so much from the treatment that old things that freaked me out and caused me to, like you said, become housebound, attempt suicide, be at the lowest point in my life. My life was no longer like that after the treatment. It really, really works. It's an extremely effective treatment.
Can you tell me about your life now and how different it is compared to when you were at your lowest point with OCD?
Absolutely. I mean, my lowest point was bad. I spent about 3 years in my house. I didn't leave. I was living alone with a roommate, but it was like a duplex situation. And so I was burning my savings, wasn't working anything. I'd leave my house Sundays to a 24-hour grocery store to buy enough supplies for the week, disconnected with my family, my friends. I mean, I had went from being an athlete and passionate about music, I can't play anything, but passionate about music and life and just being really happy, to completely a shell of myself, and was housebound, attempted suicide, was hospitalized, and everything fell apart for me. But after the treatment and really getting my life back, I started to pursue my passion. So like I've said, I've come full circle. I loved so much becoming an advocate. That was my first stop on my mental health recovery journey after getting treatment. And I was able to speak to different hospitals, and I was on, national TV shows, and I was in magazines and articles and all this sharing. And I loved that. But everybody would reach out and be like, your story's so inspirational, help me. And I'm like, but I can't. I'm not a therapist. I can help you find it, but I can't help you. And I felt something was missing. And so I started going back to school and eventually loved the world of psychology. And after graduating with a master's of science degree in psychology, was able to become a therapist. So now I treat OCD and related disorders at the Gateway Institute in Costa Mesa. I'm also one of the IOCDF's lead advocates. So I've currently host my own live stream on OCD and related disorders every other Wednesday, titled Chris's Corner. I'm also vice president of OCD Southern California. We're one of the International OCD Foundation's official affiliates, but I've just really been dedicating my life to making sure that people don't suffer as long as I did and get that treatment a lot sooner. And it's outside of just mental health. I mean, I have a great relationship with family now and friends and date. I mean, the pandemic hasn't been great, but other than that, just really, really living a full life. And that's what I want everybody to know, is that OCD can absolutely take you to your lowest point. But with science evidence-based treatment, you can get your life back. And not only that, you learn to appreciate life more after you've stared death in the face, or if your story doesn't take you that low, at least your hardest times, you become a more compassionate, understanding, and just loving life. And so I can't pretend I'm happy all the time, but definitely now I'm a very happy, I'm excited about the work I do, but also just the person I've become and the life I've created.
Well, I think that's really the important point, is that once you go through something really difficult, and let me tell you, I mean, like mental health journeys, getting to the other side, there really is a beautiful life because you have the appreciation. Everything really does seem brighter because you've seen very dark times. So I'm really glad to see that, you've also been able to use that time to help other people. And one thing that Sean said that I really liked was that he talked to his friend, and his friend recognized that he had OCD, and his friend suggested ERP therapy. And I think the importance really of talking about it is that so people can recognize, what's going on with themselves, and know that that other people are also going through, similar things. Now, I know that you also do support groups, which is a really good way for people to feel like they belong after feeling like so strange, living with a mental disorder. I mean, can you tell me about some of the support groups that you run?
Absolutely. So I run 2 weekly support groups here at the Gateway Institute, and then I do 1 monthly support group. The weekly support groups, we break it down to, we have 1 support group for adults, and then we have 1 for teens and young adults. And then the monthly group is for family and loved ones. So those people that are dating or married to or children of or parents of an individual with OCD also need support. I mean, it's such an important part of this treatment. As Shant was saying with his wife, she had to learn that the treatment for her was not to reassure and support the OCD. It was actually to stop reassurance and stop enabling. So that family and loved one support group teaches individuals that have a loved one with OCD that your role is still to be loving and supportive, but unlike most disorders, you're not going to answer their questions and reassure them. We need their brain to figure that out through the ERP. So it's being supportive, but definitely not engaging with the disorder. What I love about the teen and young adult support group is there's so much stigma and fear to talk about mental health in their teens and early 20s and mid 20s. And so just seeing people be able to come each week and meet other individuals with the disorder and talk about it and feel more confident. And they encourage people to tell in the group, to tell their best friends or to tell their parents or to tell their boyfriend or girlfriend. And the more that people have opened up about it, the more other people learn. Or a lot of times somebody says, oh my goodness, I've been dealing with that and had no clue what it was. And they end up getting treatment themselves. So building community is so important. I also think that when you have a mental health disorder, like you just said, the struggle is very, very difficult. And you can also sometimes not feel like you're getting support from family or loved ones or society itself. So having other people that get it, I know for me, I was part of a support group, and I remember meeting the first individual ever who had OCD, and I was in the same room as that person, and she was in a different place in her journey. She was about to end treatment, but I thought I was never going to get better from this horrid thing. And she was like, look, I just had my last session. I'm going to be part of this group for a little bit of time, and then move on, but you can do it like I could, and just giving me hope. And that was such a huge confidence boost in my own recovery. It felt good to know other people were out there.
Yeah, and I think just that little ounce of hope is all we need sometimes to turn the corner and to try, right? Because I think oftentimes with mental disorders, mood disorders, a sense of hopelessness can be kind of a common denominator. But yeah, that support group also helped me in that case too. I'm gonna shift a little with this question because Anna, Sean's wife, also talked about anxiety, and she talked about how her hormones triggered a mood disorder. And that actually happened with me as well. And I didn't realize that my hormones were actually causing me to go into a depression and anxiety. So can you maybe explain how hormones and mental health are sort of tied together?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mostly feel compassionate for women because there's a lot of shift with depression and anxiety sometimes around someone's period. I mean, a lot of women will say that the OCD or the anxiety or the depression is worse. There's a lot of women that really struggle through menopause, as they have that huge hormonal shift. Another big one is we see that with pregnancy. We see people with postpartum, it could be depression, it could be anxiety or OCD. Also, we see a lot of people's mental health disorders come out through puberty. So we see that 18 to 13-year-old range really, really shift, or we can see it from that 18 to 21-year-old age shift as people are ending puberty. So we know hormones has a huge part to deal with these mental health disorders. And so a lot of times, I think that it's PMDD, a lot of women can have that as well, where, each month around the time of their period, it's not the same for them as it is for other people. Like they go into a really heightened anxiety state or really, really depression, or they have a lot of different impacts. So we know that hormones has an impact on our mental health. And unfortunately for some people, I've worked with clients, for instance, with anxiety or OCD or depression, because I treat anxiety and depression as well. They've gone their whole life okay. Maybe they had little things here or there, and then they get pregnant. And they're so, they do well during the pregnancy and they're so happy. And then right after the child is born, their mental health completely deteriorates and they start going into a deep depression, maybe having suicidal intrusive thoughts or harm thoughts around the child, or finding themselves so anxious or unable to get out of bed. I worked with a woman who never had children, but when she went through through menopause, the OCD got extremely bad to the point she couldn't function and had to quit her job. So we see during those period of times that's a lot of times when people's mental health disorders first show up, or potentially come out. So that is part of what people have to work with as well. For some of my clients, what I find that when they're treating the hormones with, a medical doctor, that can help a lot. And I usually do encourage that. If somebody notices that hormones is playing a huge part in their mental health, that is always what I first recommend, is that although ERP and medication, if somebody needs to take it, is super important, this has to be treated holistically. So we have to make sure that we're seeing a doctor that can work with that. The other thing I wanted to make earlier, but I think it's a good point to make now, when we're talking about all that cortisol and stress, I know Sean talked about exercise. I always tell my clients who have depression, anxiety, and OCD that exercise can't be an other. We can't be that person who's like, yeah, I go to the gym once every 3 years. It's like, no, exercising is super important. It's burning off all that excess anxiety, hormones and stress and all of that. And it's helping people lower that and regulate that. And it release endorphins, etc. And people will often say that their depression, anxiety, OCD, etc. is better. It doesn't cure it, but is a lot better when people exercise. So what I usually suggest for clients is like a full medical workup as we start treatment to see if hormones plays a role. And there's different things that people can take. Sometimes women will get on birth control, even if they don't need it for other reasons, and that can help. Sometimes there's things with thyroid that can impact. So we just have to make sure that we're also treating that as well, if that's having an impact on mental health.
Well, that's actually what happened with me is that I took a really bad turn during menopause. And, since then I've learned I've had to go on a hormone schedule and also take some thyroid medication. And, I've just, it's been a huge change. And the thing is also, if nothing, there was nothing going on in my life that would have triggered that besides, the fact that I was going through menopause. So that's why it was also really confusing to me. And doctors don't really talk about this. So I'm really glad you brought up bringing, like doing a full medical panel, because oftentimes it can be something physical that is going on that can cause a mood disorder.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that you're opening up about your own story. I mean, I think this is the only way things get out there is when individuals who have lived through it open up to the public and say, "Hey, this is something that's happening," because there isn't a lot of people talking about it, etc. And like I said, I've worked with numerous clients now who have shown small signs maybe of anxiety or depression or OCD, very small ones, but as soon as they go through menopause, it absolutely blows up and gets really bad. And if they don't get some of the treatment that you're getting, yes, I mean ERP or CBT are absolutely great tools, but there's also something going on chemically that needs to be treated in your body. That's what I always say is like sometimes it's a team. Like for OCD, for instance, or depression or anxiety, like whether it's CBT or ERP, that has to be one of the main components that can't be neglected. But it may need to also be medication or working out or getting a medical workup to find out that there may be something going on with thyroid or hormones. So I always tell people like it's a whole thing. Like really kind of like let's treat the whole person and make sure that we're not missing any components.
Yeah, yeah. Sean did a lot of research on his OCD. Um, and he said that ERP actually has about a 80% success rate. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, it has extremely high success rate. There was a meta-analysis of a bunch of studies from different research that showed that it can be like 76 to 86% effective. I mean, it's a really effective treatment. And then if somebody also needs medication in conjunction, most people get better from it. That's the big hope for ERP and for OCD is that even if you don't go on medication, ERP alone has a huge success rate. Like you said, about 80% of individuals that engage in the treatment are going to have a huge success rate. And it's not like minute. I mean, I work with clients that come in who are like me, housebound and can't function and leave going back to college or going back to work, etc. For me, I mean, going from being housebound to being able to graduate college, which I never thought would happen. So that's what always makes me feel good about my job is that I'm like, I know that what I'm doing works. And that makes me feel good because I can honestly look the person in the eye and say, look, if you do this work, you will get better and you can get a lot better. So I always start my sessions with that so somebody has hope. And that's what was told to me when I first started treatment. My therapist said, this isn't something that may or may not work. There isn't 5% that will, no, you're going to get better if you do it. So that's what I love about this work. And you can't say that about a lot of treatments. There's a lot of other disorders where people have to constantly experiment with different medications or behavioral therapy isn't very effective. But luckily with OCD, we see that. And CBT is very effective. That's why it's the frontline treatment for most mental health disorders. People will start with CBT if it's appropriate.
Well, you mentioned medication. What is used for OCD if medication is necessary?
Yeah, so the time I always tell people because people ask, how do I know if I need to take medication? And what in my own story, I did my first 6 months of treatment without medication, but I just hit a wall. And as we were facing things that caused a lot more anxiety, the anxiety was just too great that I could not push through. And also what was happening is my brain was in so much fear without the medication that I wasn't learning from the treatment. So I did have to go on medication. But the great news is for me, about 2 years after finishing my treatment, and we stayed on medication for a while after to make sure, I got off medication. I'm not on it anymore. So it's not a lifetime sentence. But the medications that are used typically for OCD is what's known as an SSRI or a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So the common ones that people know are maybe like a Zoloft or Luvox or Prozac. I would say those are common, but there's a category of them. What the research also shows that individuals with OCD have to take a higher dosage than somebody with maybe anxiety or depression. An example is with anxiety or depression, somebody might go on 40 milligrams of Prozac, where an individual with OCD might go on 80. So the medication is titrated up. I mean, people start on a low dose and go up. And once they're on that full dose for about 3 months, they'll see that full potential of the medication. But I always remind people that medication alone is not going to get somebody better from OCD. It's going to make it more livable, but you have to be doing the behavioral therapy. So I always tell people it's something that's there as an added tool if the ERP isn't working to the full potential. And often if a client comes to me and is doing everything I'm asking them to do and they're pushing through but still not getting the results, we might explore them seeing a psychiatrist for medication management.
Okay. You know, one thing that I thought was interesting is that when I read your story, you said you finally found a therapist in Westwood to help you out. And then Sean said that he finally found his therapist at the UCLA OCD clinic. I was just wondering, gee, is this like the same place that you guys found help? I don't know. But I thought that was like a really interesting coincidence.
Yeah, so for me, I didn't go to UCLA, but it's funny because UCLA was actually one of the first places we called. And the only reason I didn't go to the UCLA OCD program is at the time they had about an 8-month waiting list. And I had just come off of, attempting suicide. And I had been for years seeing poor therapists and was back into a very suicidal state because the therapy wasn't working and I felt there was no change. So when we finally found the International OCD Foundation that pointed us to ERP and specialists, UCLA was the first place. I mean, everybody knows UCLA and we trusted UCLA. But like I said, I ended up being on a waiting list, but it was 8 months. But the funny thing is my psychiatrist, whose name is Dr. Jamie Fusner, actually was one of the heads of the UCLA program. So I knew about the UCLA program. And even though he was my psychiatrist, he did a little bit of private practice. He also helped run the UCLA program. So the UCLA program has a good reputation. I actually went to the OCD Center of Los Angeles, and it is in Westwood and is about walking distance from UCLA. So good treatment in Westwood.
Well, Chris, I am so glad that you were able to break it down for us, what OCD is, the symptoms, the treatments. Is there anything else that you would like to say about OCD or mental health?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to start with OCD is one of the hard parts about having OCD is if somebody is struggling with those more taboo intrusive thoughts, and Sean was very open about his, intrusive thoughts, and that's the subtype he was experiencing. I get that it can feel so horrific to open up to anybody, whether it's a family member, a loved one, or a therapist, because unfortunately we identify with our mental health when we don't know what it is. And so whether it's depression, anxiety, etc. So I just hope that anybody who hears this that has OCD and has been really afraid, I've had intrusive thoughts, Sean's had intrusive thoughts, but even more so, your clinician who specializes in OCD treatment will know that and provide you with the support. So with OCD, I always hope that people can get better. And I hope somebody listening to this that doesn't know what OCD is before that recognizes just what a severe disorder is. On a bigger scale, because OCD is not the only mental health disorder, depression is not just feeling sad for a day. I mean, depression can have people lose weight, not take showers, not leave their house, stop seeing their family, giving up on dreams. Suicide is very high depression. Anxiety is not just being anxious about giving a talk in class. It's where you literally have a struggle to leave your house. You want to, leave a social situation because you're so overwhelmed. You can't calm down. You feel out of control. Panic disorder. I mean, the list goes on. Social anxiety, where it's difficult just to be around other people. Mental health is not a quirk. It's not a choice. It's not something people can just snap out of. So if you have mental health, a mental health disorder, I just hope you know that there is such a vast community out there, including this amazing podcast, of people that definitely get it. And if you don't feel supported by society, we're all here to support you. And if you're somebody that doesn't have a mental health disorder and are hearing this, and maybe it's a family member, a friend, or somebody else in your life, the biggest thing that they want is not pity. They just want understanding and support. So I always say that my favorite day in the world will be one day when we know that mental health disorders are treated with the same dignity, respect, and urgency as physical health disorders. That would be the day I felt like my mission was finally met. So that's what I hope. And that's why I do this. And that's why I love stuff like what you're doing. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you. And I love your story. I love what you're doing, and you are a check your head superhero. And that is
Oh,
anyone that speaks out on mental health, helps others with their mental health, and provides solutions. I actually have T-shirts that say superhero.
I love it. I'm
But
loving
you,
the shirt.
but you are definitely one. And thank you so much, Chris Trondsen of the Gateway OCD Institute. Oh,
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Mari, for having me on. And like I said, I love what you're doing. And I'm so happy that people in the music industry have a home, a place where they can feel confident about getting support and realizing that it's not something to be embarrassed by. It's something that you're doing for your own well-being. So thank you for everything you're doing.
you're welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely.